Well, I knew you packed his stuff up. I knew that, but I didn't know how final it was.
Ladies and gentlemen, picture this. The leader of one of America's most infamous polygamous families walks into a courtroom. The air buzzing with tension, thick enough to slice. Cameras flash, microphones tilt, whispers ripple through the crowd. This isn't just another celebrity scandal. This is Kody Brown, the man who brought polygamy into America's living rooms, now standing before a judge in a battle far bigger than himself. From the moment Kody Brown and his wives stepped into the spotlight on Sister Wives, millions were captivated. They weren't just another TV family, they were an anomaly. One man, 4 wives, over a dozen children, all bound by faith, commitment, and an unconventional idea of love. To some, it was fascinating. To others, it was appalling. But regardless of opinion, one thing was certain. Kody Brown had forced America to look at something it had long tried to ignore: polygamy. The Browns claimed their lives were built on love, freedom, and religion. But for the state of Utah, those beliefs clashed with the law. Polygamy wasn't just frowned upon, it was a felony. When the Browns opened their doors to the world through reality television, they invited not just viewers, but scrutiny. And it didn't take long for that scrutiny to turn into investigation. Within weeks of the show's debut, whispers became headlines. Reports surfaced that state authorities were looking into whether Kody and his wives were breaking the law. Suddenly, Sister Wives wasn't just entertainment, it was evidence. The Browns found themselves at the center of a moral and legal storm. Kody, ever the defiant patriarch, faced a choice: retreat into silence or fight back. And if there's one thing the world had learned about Kody Brown, it's that retreat was never in his vocabulary. Instead of running, the Browns made a bold move. They would sue the state of Utah. It was a daring, history-making decision. They weren't just defending their family, they were challenging the very definition of marriage and freedom in America. When the courtroom doors opened for the first hearing, the atmosphere was electric. Kody entered with his long hair and signature confidence. But there was something different this time, a shadow behind the swagger. Behind him walked his wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, faces tight with anxiety, but unified in purpose. Across the aisle, state attorneys shuffled their notes, ready to make their case. Their argument was clear and unwavering. Polygamy laws existed for a reason: to prevent exploitation, manipulation, and abuse. To them, Kody wasn't just a man with multiple wives. He was the face of a system the state had long condemned. But Kody's attorney stood firm. This case, he declared, voice echoing through the silent courtroom, is not about crime. It's about love. It's about the freedom of consenting adults to choose how they live. The wives took turns speaking. Christine's voice trembled as she described the beauty of their large family. The laughter, the chaos, the endless circle of support. Janelle spoke practically, acknowledging the hardships but also the unbreakable strength they had built together. Robin defended her choice to join the family, emphasizing that no one had coerced her. She had chosen this life freely. Then came Mary, usually quiet, often the emotional core of the group. She spoke through tears. Polygamy isn't easy, she admitted. There's jealousy, there's struggle, but love is love. No one should tell another person who they can or cannot build a life with. The courtroom was spellbound. Reporters scribbled furiously, cameras clicked outside, and social media exploded with debate. To some, the Browns were pioneers, brave souls standing up for personal freedom. To others, they were reckless provocateurs, challenging laws that protected vulnerable people. But inside those 4 walls, one person's opinion mattered more than anyone else's: the judge's. He watched silently, weighing every word. He knew this wasn't just about one family. This was about how America defines love, privacy, and faith. For months, the case dragged on. Lawyers sparred, emotions flared, and the Browns' lives continued to unfold on national television. Viewers saw the strain, the sleepless nights, and the cracks beginning to form under the pressure. At home, the children whispered fears no child should have to voice. Will Dad go to jail? Will we be taken away? Kody tried to reassure them, but even he didn't know the answer. Beneath his confidence was a man terrified of losing everything, not just his show, but his family. Finally, the day of judgment arrived. The courtroom was packed. The Browns sat side by side, hands clasped, faces pale. The judge cleared his throat and began to read the verdict. After careful consideration, he said, "This court finds that the application of Utah's polygamy laws violates the constitutional rights of the plaintiffs." Gasps rippled through the room. Kody froze. The wives looked at one another in disbelief. The judge continued, "Adults who choose to live together as a family cannot be criminalized for doing so, even if their arrangement resembles marriage." It was a monumental win, not just for the Browns, but for thousands of families who had lived in secrecy for generations. Tears streamed down faces. Kody hugged his wives. For the first time in years, they felt free. But victories in court are often fleeting. The state of Utah wasn't about to let this ruling stand without a fight. They appealed, determined to restore the law's full power. And as the appeal wound its way through higher courts, the Browns' moment of triumph began to fade. The appellate judges overturned much of the lower court's decision, reinstating the restrictions. Polygamy was once again illegal in Utah. For Kody, it was a crushing blow. The man who had once stood as a symbol of defiance found himself facing the same barriers all over again. His victory had been historic, but temporary. Still, something had changed. The conversation was out in the open. The taboo had been challenged. And even in defeat, the Browns had made history. Their case had forced America to confront uncomfortable questions. Should consenting adults be free to live as they wish? Can love truly be legislated? And who gets to define morality in a country that prides itself on freedom? News outlets debated endlessly. Religious groups clashed with activists. And through it all, the Browns remained under a microscope. The same cameras that once celebrated their unity now captured their unraveling separations. Divorces, emotional confessions. Years later, the memory of that courtroom battle still lingered like a ghost over the family. For Christine, it had been about standing up for her children's future. For Janelle, it was about independence and strength. For Mary, it had always been about love and the right to choose. And for Kody, it had been about control, about proving to the world that he could lead his family through any storm. But that storm never truly passed. Even as the show continued, the cracks deepened. The once united family splintered under the weight of jealousy, resentment, and public pressure. Fans who once saw them as trailblazers now watched as the empire Kody built slowly crumbled. Still, one thing remained undeniable. Stepping into that courtroom had changed everything. It had turned a TV family into a national conversation. It had exposed the limits of law, the reach of faith, and the resilience of love even in the face of judgment. For some, Kody's battle symbolized courage. For others, hypocrisy. But for the Browns themselves, it was personal. A fight for dignity in a world that never truly accepted them. And while the legal system may not have granted them the freedom they hoped for, the Browns had achieved something larger. They had forced America to talk, to question, to argue, to look beyond the surface of what family means. Years later, as Kody stood reflecting on the chaos his choices had unleashed, one thing was clear. The courtroom may have decided the law, but it couldn't erase their legacy. Because in the end, the story of Kody Brown's courtroom battle wasn't about polygamy. It was about identity, belief, and the human need to live authentically, even when the world is watching. The lights faded, the headlines cooled, and the world moved on. But the Browns' defiance, their courage, and their chaos left an indelible mark on television history and on the ongoing American debate over love, law, and liberty. Kody once said that his family's story wasn't about rebellion, it was about freedom. Whether you believe that or not, one thing is certain. That day in court, when a man and 4 women stood against a state, they redefined what it means to fight for the right to live in love on your own terms. To live in love on your own terms.
But stick through it thick and thin, and we would work these things out. Because come on, you guys, can't we all just get our heads out of our butts?
If you move to
When the judge entered the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted instantly. A heavy silence descended, and every eye turned toward him. His demeanor was calm, reserved, almost unreadable. He settled into his seat, his expression giving nothing away. And the entire room seemed to lean forward as the proceedings began. The state's attorney rose first, his voice steady, confident, and deliberate. He painted a grim portrait of polygamy, framing it not as an expression of faith or love, but as a structure of exploitation. He spoke of societies where women had little choice, where children were born into a world with no freedom, and where men with multiple wives used their power to dominate. This law, he said firmly, exists to protect the vulnerable. It is our duty to enforce it. If we fail not just these families, but society itself. His words rang with authority, and though the Browns sat quietly, the weight of his argument was impossible to ignore. They were being presented not as people, but as symbols of abuse and control. And yet, in their own hearts, they knew they were none of those things. To them, their family was not about crime, it was about faith, about choice, about love. When their turn came, the Browns' lawyer rose and spoke with equal conviction. His words, though measured, carried deep passion. "This is not a case about abuse," he said. "It is not a case about crime. It is about privacy. It is about freedom. These are consenting adults freely making choices about the kind of family they wish to build. The government has no right to enter their homes, no right to tell them their love is illegal, ain't no right to criminalize them for the way they choose to live." The judge listened intently, hands clasped, face impassive. But the arguments that would leave the deepest mark on the room were not those of lawyers, but of the women themselves. One by one, the wives stood before the court. Their voices shook, their hands trembled, but their conviction never faltered. Christine painted a picture of a home filled with laughter, chaos, and warmth. "Our children are never alone," she explained. "They always have someone to turn to, someone to care for them. That's not abuse, that's abundance." Janelle acknowledged the hardships openly. She spoke of the long hours, the financial strain, the exhaustion of supporting such a large household. "It isn't easy," she admitted, "but it's my choice, and I would not trade it for anything." Robin, her voice soft but steady, refuted the accusations directly. "I was not brainwashed. I was not forced. I chose this family. I chose this love, and I am grateful for it." Then came Mary, her testimony raw with honesty. She admitted that jealousy and struggle were part of their reality. "Yes, there are days when it's hard," she said, her eyes wet with tears. "But I love my family. I love my husband. And no law should tell me that this love is illegal." Her words cut through the room with haunting clarity. For a moment, silence lingered in the courtroom. Even those skeptical of polygamy could not deny the authenticity of their voices. Outside, the media storm raged. Headlines declared, "Brown family takes on Utah." Panels debated endlessly. Was this about liberty or chaos? Faith or lawlessness? Some hailed the Browns as brave pioneers standing against outdated oppression. Others saw them as dangerous, attempting to normalize a lifestyle they believed threatened traditional marriage. Either way, the Browns were no longer just a family. They were the center of a national storm. Months dragged on as hearings came and went. The Browns grew weary. Their children, watching anxiously, asked heartbreaking questions. Will Dad go to jail? Will they split us up? Kody tried to reassure them, but deep down, he didn't know the answer. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. The family sat shoulder to shoulder, hands clenched, faces drawn with tension. The judge began to read, his voice flat and filled with legal jargon. At first it was incomprehensible, a blur of citations and clauses. But then the meaning emerged. The Browns had won. The court ruled that Utah's law as applied to them violated their constitutional rights. Adults could not be criminalized simply for living together as a family. The Browns sat stunned before the relief set in. Tears streamed down faces, hands clutched tightly, whispers of disbelief turning into sobs of joy. For the first time in years, they felt free. Cameras captured their jubilation as they stepped outside, proclaiming that love had triumphed over fear. For a brief period, the Browns lived with a lightness they had never known, walking without the constant dread of police raids or forced separation. They believed they had not only changed their own lives, but carved out a place in history for every polygamous family hiding in the shadows. But triumph has a way of slipping away. The state of Utah refused to surrender. Officials appealed, determined to preserve their law. Slowly, the case climbed higher, and when the appeals court issued its decision, everything changed again. The earlier ruling was overturned. Much of the law was reinstated. The victory that had felt so monumental was erased in a stroke. Once again, the Browns were left uncertain, defeated, and vulnerable. Kody, who had once believed they had beaten the system, realized now how immense and unyielding that system truly was. The devastation was crushing. For the wives, it was the collapse of a dream they had clung to with hope. For Kody, it was a bitter lesson in power. Yet, even in defeat, something had shifted. Their case had forced the nation to look at polygamy in a way it never had before. It was no longer whispered about in secrecy, no longer reduced to caricatures of abuse. The Browns had put real faces and real voices to the practice. Some still condemned them. Others still defended them. But no one could ignore them anymore. As years passed, new battles came. Divorces fractured the once unified family. Children grew up and left, some choosing entirely different lives. The family that had once stood together against the state began to split apart in ways no courtroom could fix. Yet, despite heartbreak, despite separation, that courtroom fight remained the most defining chapter of their story. For the wives, it had always been about protecting their children from fear. For Kody, it had been about proving that he and others like him had the right to exist without shame. It was about identity, about love, about liberty. In the end, they did not secure the permanent legal victory they sought. The law remained, the state remained steadfast, and the uncertainty never vanished. But they had won something else. They had changed the national conversation. They had made people see polygamous families not as faceless cults or shadows in the desert, but as individuals with hopes, flaws, and dignity. They became more than reality TV stars. They became symbols controversial, yes, but impossible to erase. Their children learned that their parents were willing to stand, to fight, even against overwhelming odds. Their wives learned that their sacrifices and pain had carried weight beyond the courtroom walls. And Kody, defiant as ever, knew that whatever else happened, he had refused to bow. For him, it had ceased to be about polygamy alone. It became about the freedom of every individual to define love for themselves without the state dictating terms. The years since have not been easy. Marriages collapsed, bonds frayed, and the family splintered. The glory of that victory faded, and the pain of personal struggles replaced it. Yet the courtroom battle lingers in memory as the moment they stepped beyond television and into history. Not merely as entertainers, but as challengers of law, as people who declared openly, "We are here. We love, and we will not be silenced." And that is the legacy of Kody Brown's courtroom struggler. Legacy of courage and heartbreak. Of victory and defeat. Of love set against law. Though they lost in the end, they shifted the conversation forever. They reminded the world that beyond the headlines and legal briefs are human beings, families, and dreams. Their message remains clear, echoing long after the gavel fell. Love is not a crime. And no matter the law, their voices would not be silenced. No matter the law, their voices would not be silenced.